October 25th, 1944. The Pacific Ocean swallowed the darkness just before dawn, and with it, any hope Commander Ernest Evans had of seeing another peaceful sunrise. The bridge of the USS Johnston trembled beneath his boots as he peered through salt-crusted binoculars at the horizon off Samar Island. What he saw made his blood freeze. The silhouettes of the most powerful naval force Japan had assembled: 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, and 11 destroyers, bearing down on the vulnerable American escort carriers like wolves descending upon sheep. Evans, a Cherokee American naval officer with a reputation for aggressive tactics, understood immediately that his small task unit, designated Taffy 3, stood between annihilation and survival. His destroyer, the Johnston, along with her sister ships Hole and Heermann, plus 4 smaller destroyer escorts, were called tin cans by sailors who knew their thin hulls offered little protection against the massive shells of Japanese battleships. The Imperial Japanese Navy's Center Force, commanded by Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, had somehow slipped through the American defensive net during the night, and now the mighty Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, led the charge with her 18.1-inch guns that could hurl projectiles weighing more than a small car over 25 miles. According to naval historians who later documented this engagement in publications including the U.S. Naval Institute proceedings, the Americans faced overwhelming odds that morning. The Japanese force possessed such superior firepower that a conventional naval engagement should have ended in minutes, not hours. Yet Commander Evans, known among his crew for his fighting spirit, didn't hesitate. At 07:15 hours, without waiting for orders from Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague aboard the escort carrier Fanshawe Bay, Evans made a decision that defied every tactical manual. He would charge directly at the Japanese fleet. "All ahead flank! Commence making smoke!" Evans barked, his voice cutting through the controlled chaos of the bridge. The Johnston's engines roared to life, pushing the destroyer to her maximum speed of 35 knots. Black oil smoke poured from her stacks, creating an artificial fog bank to shield the vulnerable escort carriers behind them. The crew, many barely out of their teens, scrambled to their battle stations, knowing they were steaming toward certain destruction. Lieutenant Robert Hagen, the ship's gunnery officer, later recalled the surreal moment when the Japanese shells began falling. The first salvos sent towering geysers of white water erupting around the Johnston, each miss only confirming how completely outmatched they were. The battleship Congo had opened fire, and her 14-inch shells created explosions that shook the destroyer like a toy in a bathtub. Through the smoke and spray, Hagen could see the massive pagoda-like superstructures of the Japanese warships growing larger with terrifying speed. Evans ordered the Johnston into a zigzag pattern, a desperate dance with death as shells weighing over 1,000 pounds each screamed overhead or plunged into the sea mere yards from the hull. The destroyer's 5.5-inch guns, toys compared to the Japanese weapons, fired continuously, their crews working with mechanical precision despite knowing their shells might barely scratch the enemy's armor. But Evans had a plan that didn't rely solely on gunnery. The Johnston carried 10 Mark 15 torpedoes, each packing 600 pounds of high explosive, and he intended to get close enough to use every single one. The distance closed with agonizing speed as the Johnston raced toward the heavy cruiser Kumano at the head of the Japanese formation. Commander Evans stood exposed on the bridge wing, refusing to take cover even as shrapnel from near misses whistled through the air. His executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Robert Hagen, shouted range calculations while the torpedo officer, Lieutenant John Wukovitz, prepared to launch their deadly fish at point-blank range. The crew's discipline held despite the terror that must have gripped every man aboard. They had trained for this moment, though none had imagined it would come against such overwhelming force. At 07:24 hours, with the range down to 10,000 yards, less than 6 miles, the Johnston's torpedo tube swung toward the Kumano. Evans waited, counting the seconds as Japanese shells continued to bracket his ship. The mathematics of naval warfare demanded patience. Torpedoes traveled slowly compared to ships, and firing too early would give the enemy time to evade. The Mark 15 torpedoes could achieve 46 knots, but the Johnston needed to be close enough that the Kumano couldn't simply turn away. "Fire torpedoes," Evans commanded. and 10 weapons leaped from their tubes, splashing into the Pacific and leaving trails of bubbles as they raced toward the Japanese cruiser. The torpedo crews reloaded nothing. There was nothing left to reload. They had committed their entire complement in a single, desperate salvo. For 2 agonizing minutes, the Johnston maintained her course, her 5-inch guns hammering away at the Kumano's superstructure, scoring hits that caused small fires but nothing that would slow the massive warship. Then, at 0727 hours, pillars of water and flame erupted along the Kumano's starboard side. The crew of the Johnston erupted in cheers as they witnessed the results of their attack. Multiple torpedo hits that tore open the Japanese cruiser's hull below the waterline. The Kumano's bow dropped noticeably, and she began to list as thousands of tons of seawater poured into her compartments. The heavy cruiser, moments before a deadly threat, was now limping out of formation, her speed reduced to barely 16 knots. She would spend the rest of the battle attempting to reach safety, and would eventually require months of repairs. The victory, however, came at a price. As the Johnston turned to retire behind her smokescreen, 3 14-inch shells from the battleship Congo found their mark. The first struck near the bridge, killing several men instantly and wounding Commander Evans severely. Shrapnel tore through his left hand, mangling 2 fingers that would later require amputation. The second shell penetrated the after engine room, killing the crew there and reducing the Johnston's speed by half. The third ripped through the destroyer's midsection, starting fires and knocking out several gun mounts. Evans, bleeding heavily and partially deafened by the concussions, refused to leave his post. Pharmacist's mate William Mercer attempted to treat the commander's wounds on the bridge, wrapping what remained of his hand, while Evans continued to bark orders through the smoke and flames. The engineering officer reported that they had lost power to the aft part of the ship and were now capable of only 17 knots, barely half their original speed. The Johnston was wounded, perhaps mortally, but she remained in the fight. Meanwhile, the other destroyers and destroyer escorts of Taffy 3 had followed the Johnston's example. The USS Hole, under Commander Leon Kintberger, charged directly at the battleship division, firing her guns with furious determination. The USS Heermann, commanded by Commander Amos Hathaway, maneuvered so aggressively that she nearly collided with the massive Yamato, forcing the Japanese flagship to turn away to avoid being struck. The smaller destroyer escorts, Samuel B. Roberts, Dennis, John C. Butler, and Raymond, added their firepower despite being even more lightly armed and armored than the destroyers. The battle evolved into a chaotic melee unlike any naval engagement in the Pacific War. Traditional battle lines dissolved as American destroyers and destroyer escorts wove through the Japanese fleet like terriers attacking bears, their smokescreens creating a fog of war that confused and frustrated Admiral Kurita's gunners. The escort carriers of Taffy 3, Fanshawe Bay, St. Lo, White Plains, Kalinin Bay, Kitkun Bay, and Gambier Bay, launched every available aircraft, including planes armed only with depth charges designed for submarine warfare, in desperate attempts to harass the Japanese ships. Aboard the Johnston, Commander Evans surveyed the damage and made a quick calculation. His ship was hurt but not dead, and he still had 3 operational 5-inch guns. The Japanese formation had become disorganized, with individual ships maneuvering independently rather than maintaining the disciplined formation that had approached at dawn. Historical accounts from the Naval Historical Center document that Admiral Kurita, confused by the ferocity of the American defense and believing he faced a much larger force than actually existed, began to hesitate. The smokescreens, the darting destroyers, and the swarming aircraft created an impression of chaos that masked the true weakness of the American force. The Johnston's crew, their ship listing 7 degrees and fires still burning below decks, continued to fight with grim determination. Lieutenant Robert Hagen coordinated the remaining gun mounts, directing fire at the heavy cruiser Chikuma, which had closed to within 6,000 yards. The Johnston's shells, though small, found their mark repeatedly, starting fires on the Chikuma's superstructure and damaging her fire control systems. The Japanese cruiser, frustrated by this annoying opponent, turned her full attention to the Johnston. At 0840 hours, the unequal duel between the wounded destroyer and the heavy cruiser reached its climax. The Chikuma's 8-inch guns pounded the Johnston mercilessly, and this time there was no room to maneuver, no speed to evade. Shells ripped through the thin hull plating as if it were paper, each hit creating new casualties and new damage. The forward engine room took a direct hit, killing everyone inside and reducing the Johnston to a crawl. Fire erupted from multiple compartments, and the list increased to 20 degrees. Commander Evans, now barely able to stand from his wounds and the accumulating blood loss, assessed the situation with brutal honesty. His ship was dying, his crew had performed miracles, and they had bought precious time for the escort carriers to escape. The Gambier Bay, slowest of the escort carriers, had taken heavy damage and was sinking, but the others were pulling away, protected by the smoke and the sacrifice of the destroyers. The Whole had already gone under, her crew abandoning ship as she capsized. The Samuel B. Roberts was listing heavily, fires consuming her from stem to stern. Lieutenant Hagen approached the commander, his face streaked with soot and blood. "Skipper, we've lost all power. We're dead in the water." Evans nodded slowly, looking around at the bridge crew, boys who had become men in the space of 2 hours, men who had faced death with courage that would be remembered for generations. He gave the order that every naval commander dreads: abandon ship. Pass the word to all hands: abandon ship. The crew began the grim process of leaving their ship, throwing life rafts overboard and helping wounded shipmates into the water. The Johnston's list increased to 30 degrees, and she began to settle by the stern. Commander Evans moved through the tilting passageways, checking compartments to ensure no one was left behind, despite his own wounds and exhaustion. The water temperature was 85 degrees Fahrenheit, warm enough that hypothermia wasn't an immediate threat, but sharks in the vast emptiness of the Pacific Ocean presented dangers just as deadly. At 9:45 hours, 2 hours and 30 minutes after Commander Evans had ordered his initial charge, the USS Johnston rolled onto her port side and began her final plunge. The surviving crew members, floating in clusters amid oil slicks and debris, watched as their ship's bow rose high into the air, propellers still visible above the water. For a moment, the Johnston hung suspended, as if reluctant to leave the battle, before sliding beneath the waves with a sound like distant thunder. 327 men had sailed into battle aboard her that morning. Only 141 would survive to be rescued days later. Commander Ernest Evans was not among the survivors. Multiple witnesses reported seeing him helping wounded men into the water until the very end, refusing to save himself while any of his crew remained in danger. He went down with his ship, a captain who embodied the naval tradition of placing his crew's welfare above his own. His body was never recovered, claimed by the same ocean that had witnessed his magnificent defiance. For his actions that day, Evans would be posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the first Native American naval officer to receive the nation's highest military decoration. The battle off Samar continued for another hour after the Johnston's sinking, but the momentum had shifted dramatically. Admiral Kurita, shaken by the ferocity of the American defense and uncertain about what other forces might be approaching, made a decision that would be debated by historians for decades. He ordered his fleet to withdraw. The center force, which should have annihilated Taffy 3 and proceeded to destroy the American landing forces at Leyte Gulf, turned north and retreated from the battlefield. The sacrifice of the destroyers and destroyer escorts had accomplished the impossible. They had turned back the most powerful surface fleet Japan still possessed. Accounts compiled by Samuel Eliot Morison in his authoritative History of United States Naval Operations in World War II described the confusion in the Japanese command structure during those critical hours. Admiral Kurita believed he was facing fleet carriers rather than the much more vulnerable escort carriers, and the aggressive attacks by the tin cans convinced him that he was steaming into a trap. The smokescreens prevented accurate assessment of American strength, and the damage inflicted by torpedoes and 5-inch gunfire, while not catastrophic to most Japanese ships, demonstrated that the Americans were willing to fight with suicidal determination. The USS Heermann survived the battle, her hull riddled with holes but her crew intact. Commander Amos Hathaway would later describe the moment when the Japanese fleet turned away. "We couldn't believe it. We thought they would finish us off any minute, but they just turned around and left. We had nothing left to fight with, but they didn't know that." The Heermann's bold maneuvers, including her near collision with the Yamato, had contributed to Admiral Kurita's belief that he faced a much more formidable opponent than reality. The destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts, nicknamed Sammy B., fought until she could fight no more. Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland, her captain, ordered his crew to fire over 600 rounds from their two 5-inch guns, far exceeding the normal rate of fire and risking explosions from overheated gun barrels. The Roberts closed to within 4,000 yards of the Japanese heavy cruisers, point-blank range in naval terms, and fired her 3 Mark 15 torpedoes before shells from the Chikuma and Chokai crippled her beyond hope of survival. Of her crew of 178 men, 89 died when she sank at 9:35 hours. The human cost of the battle off Samar was staggering for such a short engagement. Over 1,000 American sailors died aboard the Gambier Bay, Johnston, Hole, Samuel B. Roberts, and in the waters afterward, many succumbing to wounds, exposure, or shark attacks during the 2 days before rescue ships arrived. The escort carrier St. Lo, though she survived the surface battle, was struck by a kamikaze aircraft shortly after the Japanese fleet withdrew, becoming the first major warship sunk by a suicide aircraft attack. She exploded and sank within 30 minutes, killing 114 of her crew. The survivors of the Johnston floated in the Pacific for over 40 hours before rescue arrived. The oil slicks from their sunken ship provided some protection from the sun, but the constant threat of sharks, the trauma of wounds, and the psychological horror of watching shipmates slip beneath the waves created an ordeal almost as terrible as the battle itself. Lieutenant Robert Hagen, the senior surviving officer, organized the men into groups tied together by ropes and life jackets, ensuring they wouldn't drift apart in the currents. On October 27, 1944, 2 days after the battle, American ships finally reached the survivors. The destroyer escort Dennis, which had fought alongside the Johnston during the battle, located the groups of floating sailors and began the grim work of pulling them from the water. Many men were delirious from dehydration and sun exposure. Others had succumbed to wounds sustained during the battle. The rescue crews worked with desperate efficiency, knowing that every hour in the water increased the chances of losing more men. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, commander of Taffy 3, filed a report with Pacific Fleet headquarters that began with words of profound admiration. The courage and devotion of the officers and men who fought off Samar can only be described as beyond belief. They faced the finest ships in the Japanese Navy and forced them to retreat through sheer willpower and determination. No greater display of naval valor has ever been witnessed. Sprague's carrier, the Fanshawe Bay, had taken 6 direct hits from Japanese shells but survived, largely because the destroyers had drawn fire away from the vulnerable escort carriers. The Japanese Navy's perspective on the battle emerged through post-war interviews and captured documents. Admiral Kurita defended his decision to withdraw, citing the confusion created by smokescreens, the apparent presence of fleet carriers, and the unexpectedly fierce resistance from American forces. Critics within the Japanese command structure, however, argued that he had thrown away Japan's last opportunity to strike a decisive blow against American naval power. The center force had accomplished nothing despite possessing overwhelming superiority in firepower and armor. According to research published in the Journal of Military History, the Battle off Samar represented a turning point in Pacific naval warfare, though not in the conventional sense of territorial gain or strategic position. Instead, it demonstrated that determination and tactical aggression could overcome material disadvantage under specific circumstances. The American destroyers had not merely delayed the Japanese fleet, they had broken its will to continue the attack. This psychological victory proved as important as any physical damage inflicted. The wreckage of the USS Johnston remained undiscovered for over 70 years. In October 2019, a team of undersea explorers led by Victor Vescovo located the destroyer's remains at a depth of 20,900 feet, more than 4 miles beneath the surface of the Pacific Ocean. The discovery confirmed that the Johnston had fought to the very end. Her guns were found in firing position, and the torpedo tubes were empty. The ship's bell, covered in marine growth but still recognizable, bore silent witness to the courage of her crew. The discovery sparked renewed interest in the battle and the men who fought it. Historians returned to archival records, interviewed the dwindling number of survivors, and pieced together details that had remained obscure for decades. The depth at which the Johnston was found, deeper than the Titanic, in crushing pressure that makes exploration extraordinarily difficult, added to the ship's mystique. She had descended to one of the deepest points in any ocean, taking with her the remains of men who had given everything in defense of their comrades. The awards and decorations bestowed upon the crews of Taffy 3 told the story of extraordinary valor. Commander Ernest Evans received the Medal of Honor posthumously. Commander Leon Kintberger of the Whole received the Navy Cross. Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland of the Samuel B. Roberts received the Navy Cross. Dozens of Silver Stars, Bronze Stars, and Purple Hearts were distributed among the survivors. The USS Johnston herself received the Presidential Unit Citation, an award rarely given to individual ships in recognition of collective heroism that transcended individual acts. The comparison between the American destroyers and their Japanese opponents highlighted the dramatic contrast in material resources. The battleship Yamato displaced 72,000 tons fully loaded, carried 9 18.1-inch guns that could penetrate any armor afloat, and was protected by steel plating up to 26 inches thick in critical areas. The USS Johnston, by contrast, displaced merely 2,100 tons, carried 5 5-inch guns that could barely scratch battleship armor, and was protected by steel plating less than an inch thick in most places. Yet the Johnston had charged directly at the Yamato's screening ships without hesitation. The tactical lessons from Samar were studied at naval academies worldwide for decades afterward. The battle demonstrated the importance of aggressive action in the face of overwhelming odds, the value of smoke screens in creating confusion, and the psychological impact of determined resistance. It also highlighted the vulnerabilities of even the most powerful ships when facing opponents willing to close to point-blank range. Admiral Kurita's decision to withdraw, while controversial, was partly based on the fear that more American forces were approaching, a fear created entirely by the aggressive tactics of the destroyers and destroyer escorts. The families of the men lost aboard the Johnston whole, and Samuel B. Roberts received telegrams that began with the stark words, "The Navy Department deeply regrets to inform you." These notifications, delivered to homes across America, brought the war's reality to communities far from the Pacific battlefield. Gold Star mothers and widows joined the growing ranks of those who had sacrificed loved ones to the war effort. The small towns that had sent their sons to sea, places like Muskogee, Oklahoma, Des Moines, Iowa, and dozens of others, erected memorials and named parks and streets after their fallen heroes. The strategic impact of the Battle off Samar extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. The Japanese Navy, already weakened by losses at Midway, the Philippine Sea, and countless smaller engagements, lost irreplaceable confidence in their ability to contest American naval supremacy. The center force's withdrawal allowed the Leyte landing operations to proceed without interference from surface ships, and the subsequent American conquest of the Philippines cut Japan's supply lines to the resource-rich Dutch East Indies. Some historians argue that Samar, more than any single battle, sealed Japan's fate by eliminating the possibility of a negotiated peace through military success. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague's radio message during the height of the battle became legendary in naval circles. As Japanese shells fell around the escort carriers and the destroyers charged toward certain destruction, Sprague transmitted in plain language, uncoded, so that every ship could hear. "Situation critical. Enemy fleet closing on Taffy 3. Request immediate assistance." The message's simplicity and urgency conveyed the desperation of the moment better than any elaborate tactical report could have. Ships throughout the Pacific altered course toward Samar, though none arrived in time to participate in the surface battle. The survivors of the Johnston carried physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. Lieutenant Robert Hagen, who had coordinated the ship's gunnery during the battle and organized survivors in the water afterward, rarely spoke publicly about his experiences. When he did grant interviews in his later years, he focused not on the heroism, but on the shipmates who didn't come home. "We did what we had to do," he would say simply. "The real heroes are the guys who stayed behind on those guns, knowing they wouldn't make it out." Pharmacist's mate William Mercer, who had treated Commander Evans's wounds on the bridge while shells exploded around them, returned to civilian life as a doctor. His medical degree, earned after the war on the GI Bill, seemed almost anticlimactic compared to the battlefield surgery he had performed aboard a dying destroyer. Patients who complained of minor ailments sometimes saw a distant look in Dr. Mercer's eyes, as if he were remembering a time when holding together a commander's mangled hand while the ship burned around them constituted a normal morning's work. The Japanese sailors who survived the battle also carried memories that haunted them. Crew members from the heavy cruiser Kumano, which had been torpedoed by the Johnston's opening salvo, later described their shock at seeing such a small ship charging directly at their formation. "We thought they must be insane," one petty officer recalled in a post-war interview. "A destroyer attacking battleships and heavy cruisers? It was either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid, and as we watched them keep coming despite our fire, we realized it was both." Admiral Kurita faced intense criticism from within the Japanese Navy for his decision to withdraw. Some officers argued that he should have pressed the attack regardless of losses, that the destruction of the American landing forces at Leyte Gulf was worth the sacrifice of the entire center force. Kurita defended his choice by pointing to the effective American resistance and the possibility of additional enemy forces approaching, but his reputation never fully recovered. He spent the remainder of the war in shore assignments and retired quietly after Japan's surrender. The destroyer escort crews, often overlooked in accounts that focused on the larger destroyers, also deserved recognition for their role in the battle. The USS Dennis, Raymond, and John C. Butler had remained in formation with the escort carriers, laying smoke screens and firing their smaller guns at targets far beyond effective range. The USS Samuel B. Roberts, as previously noted, had charged alongside the destroyers despite being even more lightly armed and armored. Commander Copeland's post-action report included the memorable phrase, "We fought like we had nothing left to lose because we really didn't." The aviation crews from the escort carriers played a crucial supporting role that often went underappreciated. Pilots flying FM-2, Wildcat fighters and TBM Avenger torpedo bombers made repeated strafing runs on Japanese ships, despite having exhausted their ammunition and bombs. Some pilots made dry runs, flying directly at Japanese ships without weapons, simply to distract gunners and create the impression of continued air attacks. Lieutenant Commander Edward Huxtable, commanding the composite squadron from the Gambier Bay, made over 20 attack runs during the battle, eventually being shot down and spending hours in the water before rescue. Part 8. Remembrance and Reflection. 79 years after the Battle off Samar, veterans organizations and naval historians continue to commemorate the engagement as one of the finest examples of naval courage in American history. Annual ceremonies at the Navy Memorial in Washington, D.C., draw smaller crowds each year as the generation that fought the war passes away, but the significance of the battle remains unchanged. The actions of Commander Evans and his fellow destroyer captains are taught at the United States Naval Academy as examples of leadership under impossible circumstances. The comparison between resources and resolve that characterize the battle offers timeless lessons about warfare and human nature. The Japanese center force possessed every material advantage: larger guns, thicker armor, greater numbers, superior speed in many cases. Yet they retreated before an inferior force. The American destroyers and destroyer escorts possessed none of these advantages, but refused to accept the logical outcome of the engagement. This willingness to fight despite overwhelming odds, to charge forward when prudence suggested retreat, transformed a tactical defeat into a strategic victory. Modern naval officers studying the battle often focus on Commander Evans's decision to attack without waiting for orders. In an era of centralized command and control, where communications technology allows admirals to micromanage individual ship movements, Evans's initiative stands out as both admirable and potentially problematic. Had his attack failed completely, had the Johnston been sunk without inflicting damage or buying time for the carriers to escape, Evans might have been criticized for throwing away his ship uselessly. Success justified his aggression, but the gamble was extraordinary. The wreck of the USS Johnston, resting in its deep ocean grave, has become a war memorial in itself. The Philippine Sea above her remains an active shipping lane, and occasionally vessels passing overhead pause to drop wreaths or hold services for the men who died there. The depth of the wreck, over 20,000 feet, means that it will likely never be disturbed by salvage operations or souvenir hunters. The crushing pressure at that depth creates a natural sanctuary, preserving the final resting place of heroes who deserve eternal peace. The families of the Johnston's crew have maintained connections across generations. Children who never knew their fathers or grandfathers have formed associations to preserve memories and share stories passed down through family lore. Reunion gatherings, held annually for decades after the war, eventually ceased as survivors aged and died, but descendants continue the tradition. These gatherings serve not only as memorial services, but as affirmations that sacrifice matters, that courage deserves remembrance, and that the men who charged into hopeless battle off Samar remain relevant to contemporary Americans. The Japanese ships that participated in the battle met various fates. The Yamato, which had turned away from the aggressive American destroyers, was sunk 6 months later during Operation Ten-Go, the naval component of the defense of Okinawa. She went down under relentless air attacks, her massive guns unable to elevate high enough to engage the aircraft that destroyed her, a fitting metaphor for the obsolescence of battleships in modern naval warfare. The heavy cruiser Kumano, torpedoed by the Johnston during the opening minutes of the battle, survived only until November 25, 1944, when American aircraft finally sent her to the bottom near Luzon. The legacy of the battle off Samar extends beyond military history into American cultural memory as a story of ordinary men performing extraordinary acts. The crews of those destroyers and destroyer escorts were not professional warriors in the ancient sense. They were farmers, factory workers, students, and clerks who answered their nation's call and found themselves facing the ultimate test of courage. That they passed this test, that they charged forward when every rational calculation said to retreat, speaks to something fundamental about human nature and the bonds that form among men in combat. In the final analysis, the Japanese did laugh at the tin can destroyers until October 25, 1944, when Commander Ernest Evans and his fellow captains demonstrated that thin hulls and light guns meant nothing compared to determined hearts and aggressive spirits. The escort carriers escaped, the landing at Leyte proceeded, and the war in the Pacific continued its inexorable march toward Japan's home islands. All of this was possible because a handful of small ships, crewed by brave men, refused to accept the inevitable and instead wrote one of the most glorious chapters in naval history across the waters off Samar.